So we're going to be talking about using a Docker container as a development environment with Visual Studio Code. And this workshop is part of the workshop library that my team has been working on for the past few months. You may have seen some other sessions from this series. And today I'm going to be walking through the actual workshop with you, but then also giving you tips on how to effectively deliver this workshop to your communities. So it's kind of going to be like a little bit more informal, and I would invite you to ask questions, interrupt me, and come off mute right in the chat whenever you have any. This is something that you'll also want to set ahead of time with the folks that you're presenting to, what your preferred method of receiving questions during the session is. But in this session, you can just unmute and we can talk about it. So if you haven't seen it, let me just pull this up real quick. I just want to show our workshop library, and this is the home of all of the workshops that my team has been working on. And then if you go to the full workshops, this is where you'll find the Getting Started with Development Containers one. And I like to start by kind of going through the README a little bit. So this is the source for the Learn module, which is what we'll be roughly following in this session. And then we have some goals, what you'll need to get set up, the duration, the PowerPoint. This is really important. The PowerPoint is here, which is a tool that we've created for you to be able to just grab and go, and then you'll be able to teach this workshop to your communities. And it comes with notes. It comes with basically everything you need to deliver the presentation. So what I like to do is get started in the deck. And so I'll have that open. And something that's really important to talk about with the folks that you're presenting to is the prereqs. And especially for this workshop, there's kind of a few prereqs that you want to make sure that folks have before you get started. And one of the important things for this one is having Docker Desktop installed on your computer. So if you are sending out an email with the invitation for the workshop, maybe you also send them these prerequisites so that they have them installed on their machines ahead of time. And this is going to make it a bit easier to just get started once you start the workshop. And then the learning objectives here, we're going to use the containers extension inside of VS Code to load and connect a sample project in VS Code in a container. And so you'll learn how to also customize settings within that container and then add additional software to that development environment. And so we're going to go through all of these steps together, and this will also be the steps that you do in the workshop. So here's what the agenda looks like. Kind of just chatted about that. And so basically what we're going to do first is some setup. And let's talk a little bit about why you would use containers inside of an educational environment. So if you're working with your friends on a hackathon project and the project is in Python and you're all working on your different computers, you kind of want to make sure that you're all using the same version of Python with the same extensions in VS Code and kind of have a seamless environment set up between all of your computers. And one of the ways you can do that is to create a container that has all of these tools in it. And then each person can just open up this container, open up the project in the container, and then you'll have the same environment so that there's not any discrepancies when you go to like merge your code or any kind of things like that. So that's kind of the idea of why you'd want to use a container. And to prepare the project, we have to do a few things. That involves cloning the sample repo, which is found in the Learn module, installing the containers extension, and then if you're on a Windows computer, you may have to do some additional configurations to Docker. If you're on a Mac computer, it should just work. But at this point is where we'll kind of switch over to looking at the Learn module and the VS Code, because we covered a little bit of this intro. And actually, one more slide I would like to cover is how the extension that we're going to use inside of VS Code works. So this is what this little chart is kind of explaining what happens when you use VS Code on your local computer versus what happens when you use it in a container. And you'll kind of see this happen as we move into the VS Code. So let me set up the Learn module and the VS Code instance. And something you want to do when you present the workshop is make sure that it's big enough for everyone to see. So can someone just confirm that all of this is pretty easy to read on their screen? Cool. So thanks, Kavya. Thank you. Okay, cool. So a tip that I would like to give for this workshop in particular is, as the presenter, prepare the project ahead of time, because sometimes loading the initial image of the project inside of the container can take up to like 20 minutes. And so you kind of don't want to be sitting in the room with all of the folks that you're giving the workshop to waiting for the image to load. In subsequent loads, it should be much faster, but it really just kind of like depends on the day, your computer, your Wi-Fi, so many different things that it's just nice to set it up ahead of time. So I've gone ahead and done that. And all I did was clone the sample repo inside of VS Code, installed the remote containers extension, and then in the next section, opened up the dev container. So there's very detailed instructions inside of the Learn module about how to add the development container configuration files. And so basically this is what I've already done. And so now we're able to look at the files that we have. So when you create the development container, it will create this .dev container folder inside of your file structure in VS Code. And that contains two things: the dev container.json file, which has all of the information about what's in the dev container, and then the Docker file. And we'll talk about each one of those a little bit more in detail in a second here. So how you know that you're inside of a dev container is if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, you should see the dev container and also the version of Python or the version of whatever software you're running inside of the container. So this is a dev container that's running Python 3. And what you can do to double check that is inside of the integrated terminal in VS Code, if you type, oops, I don't know what's going on there. There we go. If you type Python version, you should get the version of Python that you have on inside of this container. And something important to note here is that this may not be the version of Python that I have on my local computer. I may not have Python on my local computer at all. So this is really illustrating the importance of using containers, because you can have consistency across the Python version, across multiple machines, across multiple development containers, without even having to download it on your computer. So it's a really, really useful tool. So the next thing we're going to do is install the project dependencies. And if you look inside of your file structure again, you'll see this requirements.txt. Kavya, did you have a question? Okay. If you do have a question, feel free to go off mute. I'm happy to answer anything during the session. So in the requirements.txt, you'll see kind of what it's going to download. And if we run this command inside of the terminal, it will install all of those requirements. So again, this is really useful because if you have multiple machines trying to work on the same project, everyone will have the same software installed on their machine. And we're going to run this command to start the project. This is just a little sample project, but we're going to get to see what it looks like. And it will say it's running on this port. So we can open up this guy and see we have this like little products viewer. This is our sample project. Got some gnomes, some microwaves, what brand they are, what price they are, just like a little table that's running in Python and Flask. Cool, so we have this Python web app. It's running with Flask on our local computer, even though all of our development environment is inside of a container. And now we're going to look at how we can actually customize what's going on inside of that devcontainer.json folder and inside of the Docker file to customize the project and the settings. So let's step by step check out the devcontainer.json file. So in the build section, this is defining how the container will be created. So you'll see the Docker file is indicated as like the other thing that's in the .dev container folder that was created. And we have the Python version that's being used, and we don't have a Node version, that's okay. And then we have our settings. And this is machine-specific settings that are being copied into the container. So you might have different settings in your instance of Visual Studio Code, but when you open it in this container, it's going to have these specific set of settings. And again, really great for ensuring consistency across multiple machines. So these settings specifically, they're optimizing for Python editing because this project is in Python. And so finally, there are the IDs of some extensions that are going to be installed when it's opened in this container. And you can use this section of the dev container file to add even more extensions that you want to be automatically included in this development environment. And we'll kind of do that later with a little example. And then the post create command right here that's commented out is basically the commands that will run after the container is created. So something we'll do later is show how you can automatically get it to run that install requirements command without even having to write it in the terminal. It will just automatically run when you open the container. So let's do those things that we talked about. So we're going to add this extension called Jinja to our extensions array in the dev container file. So we'll go over to the extensions pane and look up Jinja. So I already have it installed. I'm going to go ahead and right click and copy the extension ID. And that's what you're going to need to add it to the dev container.json file. So when I hop back over to my JSON file, I can just add it to the array. And then we're just going to give that a quick save. And then we're going to uncomment that post create command that I just talked about so that it will automatically run this when you open this project in this container. So then we're going to rebuild. We're going to open the command palette and go to rebuild container. So it's kind of going to do a little refresh and it's going to start the container from the top. So you can see it's running that post create command and that we have the Jinja extension And we also have, oops, we also have the requirements.txt file already run. So let's look at what the Jinja extension actually does and why it would be useful in this case. So if we go to the project and we look at the index.html file and we look at this for loop, it does this really nice kind of like syntax highlighting, and that's what the extension provides. So essentially, if you know you're going to be working with Python for a project, it's really nice to have some idea of what extensions might be helpful for folks who are using Python, like whether it's making the syntax highlighting light up, or a linter, or some kind of tool that you know will make working with Python easier if you know you're working on a Python project. And the same applies for all different softwares and technologies that you're using inside of VS Code. So we're going to go ahead and run it again. Let's open a little terminal. And you notice that I did not have to run that install requirements during this, or in this new container. And we'll see that the app still works, which means that it ran on its own. I'll just give this a little refresh. And we know that it's there. Cool. So the next thing we'll talk about is how to add additional software. And this is really cool too, because you can customize what's available for inside of your dev container. So we have our dev container.json file and our Docker file. And basically there's a couple different ways to install software inside of this container. And one of them is to do it in the integrated terminal, but you have to, if you make any changes to the dev container folder after you install something using the integrated terminal, you'll have to reinstall it every time you rebuild your container. So the easiest way to do it is to use that post create command property that we saw inside of the dev container.json file. And this runs the commands after the container is created automatically. So this is where we can put any commands that will add software to our container. However, the most efficient way to do it is to use the Docker file. So this is the first time we're actually going to go into the Docker file, see what's there, and see how we can add some new software. So this is what we currently have in here. We don't need these extensions right now. And so this is what we're going to add. And the run command is creating a new layer. And the layers are how the container knows what has changed and what it needs to keep updating when you rebuild it. So like we just noticed, if we do it using the terminal or if we use it during the post create command, there are still some updates that you need to do every time you rebuild. And then using this run command is going to make the container know that it needs to keep track of all of these things every time you rebuild it. We have some line breaks at the end of a line, and these are important for multiple line commands. The ampersands are how you add a command to the run line. The front end, the Debian front end export avoids warnings when you go on to work with your container. And so there's a bunch of different like flags and parameters that you can use to customize this. So what we're going to do is modify the Docker file so that it also installs Node.js, which is a common framework that we would use to make a website. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to make sure that it's available inside of the container, just to double check our work. So we have our Docker file. We're going to add this piece of code. Let's just add it after this. And we're going to save that, and then we're going to rebuild the container once again. Don't need that. Okay, cool. So it's done rebuilding. And now we're just going to go in and check if or check what version of Node exists inside of this container. And this is what we did with Python in the very beginning too. So this is a good way to kind of see what's available to you and double check that whatever things you added to your Docker file or your devcontainer.json file are actually working as you wanted them to. So we're just going to do node -- version, and we see that we have a node version available inside of the container. So we customized our dev container by adding additional software, and we also added some customizations in the form of extensions to the devcontainer.json file. Let's do a quick knowledge check to see how we're doing. And you can come off mute or write your responses in the chat. So the first question is, after you've added a dev container configuration to a project, how do you open that project in the container? Does anyone have an idea? Let's try to walk through them and see if any of them sound familiar to you. So the first option is the project automatically opens in the container. Remember that we're using the remote containers extension inside of VS Code, and we had to run some commands in the command palette to get it to open in a container. So it's probably not that one. Select add development configuration files from the command palette. The question says that we've already added a dev container configuration, so unless we're redoing it, it's probably not that one. And then we have use the reopen in container option in Visual Studio Code. I think it's that one because we had to run that command inside of the command palette to get it to reopen after we set up those configuration files. So we're going to choose that one. And just to talk about starting the project from the terminal, we do that after we've reopened the project inside of the container. So it's also not that option. And then we talked about this. How do you run additional commands after the dev container has been created? And we did this with the requirements.txt file. So if you remember how we did that, feel free to jump in or write in the chat. Kavya said, can this container support any other programming language? Yes, it can. So this is an example of how you would use this Python sample project and open it inside of a container, but hopefully using the instructions that have been given in this workshop and in the Learn module, you would be able to create a new container for any programming language, any software, anything that you want to use for your particular project. So it's basically just trying to give you the skills so that you'd be able to create your own container and then open anything or open your project inside of that container, and also share that container with whoever you're working on your hackathon project with or your homework with. So for this question, we used the post create command property inside the devcontainer.json, and you can see that here. And so any additional commands that you want to run after the dev container has been created, you would add to this section or to this code right here. So we'll pick that one. And then finally, how would you install additional software in a container so that it's saved as part of the configuration? And this is kind of the last thing we did in this module, if anyone has a guess of what that would be. And here's a hint. So we can see in the Docker file, we added this run apt-get update command, and that was what enabled us to add Node to our environment and have it saved as part of the configuration. So it would be this one. Yay. Okay, so there's a summary at the end of the Learn module, and then I think when you're giving this talk, I like to go back to the slides at the end and talk about, you can also run the knowledge check from inside of the slides, by the way, if you would like to do that. But we have our summary, and kind of what Kavya just asked, we just learned how and why you would use a container as a development environment and how you can customize your development environment with the software, the programming languages, anything you need for a particular project. And hopefully you're able to take everything you learned in this session and apply it to your own project or anywhere you would want to have a development environment. So finally, we have this slide where we're encouraging everyone to learn more about this topic. If you're interested, there's even more resources on how you can create these development containers. So Kavya, this might be a useful link for you. Learn to create a development container if you wanted to create one that uses another programming language, for example. And then, yeah, if you have any feedback on this workshop or other workshops, you can fill out the survey here. And also would encourage you to ask folks that you present this workshop to also fill out the survey. And one tip I forgot to mention for the slides in particular, if you're presenting this to a specific audience that you want to customize it for, you can change anything in these slides, like it's fully able to be edited to match the purposes of your presentation. So feel free to use your creativity to make this even better for you. This is just meant to be some guidelines of kind of what we thought was useful. But yeah, if there are any other questions about the content of the workshop as well as tips for giving workshop, I'm happy to answer any of those. And you can just go off mute or write in the chat.
Hello. You can summarize what we have discussed.
Sorry, what was that? Can you repeat that?
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. Could you speak up a little bit?
Okay, you can summarize what we have discussed.
And you can just go off mute or write in the chat.
Hello. You can summarize what we have discussed.
Sorry, what was that? Can you repeat that?
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. Could you speak up a little bit?
Okay, you can summarize what we have discussed.
Oh, Ornella, she says, could you summarize it a little? I think she joined in a little bit after you started.
Oh, sure. Okay, so this session, and it was recorded, so we'll have it available for you after if you want to go back and watch it. What we did in this session was talk about how to use a Docker container as a development environment inside of Visual Studio Code. And in the session, we went through the steps of how to do that. And then I also gave tips on how to present this workshop to your peers as part of the workshop library series. And it will be available online afterwards if you want to go back and look at it in detail. But that's kind of the summary of what we worked on. And just to kind of reiterate again why you would want to use a containerized development environment, the example I like to give is if you're working on a hackathon project with a bunch of your classmates and you all have different computers, versions of Visual Studio Code, different extensions installed, different languages installed, you can create a development container that has all of the software and languages that you would need for your particular project. And then everyone can open the project inside of the development container so that you're all working on like a cohesive, seamless environment. And so when you go to merge your code or something to GitHub, there's not going to be any issues of someone opening it in an environment that doesn't match the one that it's supposed to be opened in. So I think it's really cool for that reason. Kavya said, does the Learn module cover everything from beginner to advanced? So we can look at it again really quick, but we basically went through the entire Learn module during the session. So that's kind of what it covers. And this one does have these prerequisites. So I would say it's a little bit intermediate in that you should know a bit about what it means to run code and install a new language. I would say there's some basic Docker knowledge that might be useful, but like as you saw during the presentation, if you have a Mac, you just have to have Docker running on your computer. You don't actually have to go in there and do anything. So it's possible to just do everything from Visual Studio Code. If you're wondering though about what you can do, so here's there's a section in the workshop called pre-learning where you can see like an overview of containers, an introduction to Git, and then there's also the next steps, the post-learning that I shared. So there's just more information here, and you can kind of take this information and make it a little bit more beginner or a little bit more advanced by combining it and mixing and matching.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you
Thanks
so
for
much,
joining.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.